Over the past few videos, we've been looking at lots of the wonderful things that you can do with Blazor, running C# on WebAssembly inside your browser, and meaning you don't have to write JavaScript. And in fact, that's one of the things you'll see people claim about Blazor: you don't need to write JavaScript anymore. But in fact, that's not entirely true, because there are a number of things that are not accessible from C# even in Blazor. Things like certain APIs you have in the browser, like the geolocation API, like the Canvas API, and also even direct interaction with the DOM itself. So although we can interact with the DOM within our component using the data bindings and that sort of thing, and using the Razor syntax, what we can't do is what we can do in JavaScript directly, or maybe using a library like jQuery, which is just grab hold of a bit of the DOM, manipulate it in some way, and get the display to change. And so what we're going to look at this week is the idea of JavaScript interop, where from within our C# in Blazor, we can then call a JavaScript function that we'd write in the normal way and get it to do something that we can't do directly from the C#. And then going on from that, we're also going to see the reverse, where we can have some JavaScript that actually calls back to our C# and back into our Blazor. Now, the actual example I'm going to show you for this is something that's suggested to me by a subscriber, a gentleman called Sharaf Mansour, who wanted to know about how we can dynamically switch between different bits of CSS and different styling. So the sort of examples were maybe if you just wanted users to be able to select a particular theme, like a dark theme or a light theme or something like that. Or maybe if on your website you want particular themes and styles on specific days of the year, like you might want something to happen just on Christmas Day or at Halloween or whatever those special days might be. And you want to do this easily, so you don't have to do lots and lots of coding, so that with the minimum amount of coding you can switch between the styles. So that's what we're going to look at here. So if we just take a look at this, here we've got, as ever, our Blazor application, and so there we've got our list of book reviews that we've been looking at over various videos. So what I wanted to do here was, in as simple a way as possible, make it so that we can switch to different styles. We don't want to have to make lots and lots of changes, we just want to have one place, one thing to do, and switch a whole load of styles. So the first bit of that is actually just going to be pure CSS. So what we'll do is we'll firstly add a specific CSS file for our book review. So if we go into Pages, add new item, go for CSS, and remember we need to call this bookreviews.razor.css to associate it with the component. And then what I'm going to do in here is put the style that I want to have for this Halloween theme, let's go for. And actually what that's going to be is I'm going to have a TD, and then we're going to give that a font family of a thing called Creepster. Now this actually is a Google font, and if we just take a look in our index.html, you'll see I've already added those lines to get hold of this Google Creepster font. So it's just a slightly horrific style font. What we'll also do in there is we'll give it a font size, and I'm going to change the color. Go for floral white, and also let's put a bit of a spooky shadow on there. So if we have a text shadow, then that will just make it stand out a little bit. So that's the style we're going to want to have. But of course, at the moment, if we have that style, then it's just going to apply all the time and isn't going to be something we can dynamically switch. So the trick we can do here is this. We're going to here say body. Well, obviously everything is inside your body, so that doesn't at the moment have any effect. But then I'm going to say body.Halloween. Okay, so now we'll only get the Halloween styling on a TD inside a body that has had the Halloween class applied to it. So we don't need to apply the Halloween class to TDs or anything else. It just means we'll apply it to the body, and anything inside the body will pick up that styling. And in fact, let's also do a slight other change as well. If we go to the global one, just so we can see how this works both on the isolated CSS and the global one, and down here I'll do a similar sort of thing. So I'm going to say body.Halloween, and then what I'm going to put in here is actually a background image. And you'll see I've in here under images, I've popped in a couple of images there, one called background, one called pop-up. So I'm going to make that one to be the URL, and that's going to be images, and then background. And then in fact, I don't want to apply that to the entire body. What I want to apply that to is if we go and look inside the main layout. So that's the basic layout where we've got our nav menu that we've put in there. And I basically want it to be in here. So what I'm going to add on to that is in here, we're going to say main arrow article. So we can see that is the article we've got there that's a direct descendant of main, but still has to be ascendant of body.halloween. And then just a few more things I want to put on there. We'll have a background repeat of no repeat, and we'll have a background color of black, and we'll have a background position of center top. And so if we run that up, of course, and go to the book reviews page, it makes no difference whatsoever, but that's because we haven't applied the class yet. Now we could do that statically very, very simply. So we could just go into, again, this index. There's our body. So if we say body class equals Halloween, now when we run that up and go to the book reviews and give it a Control F5, we can see that that's what we've got. So here we can see we've got this Creepster font with the red text shadow. There we can see we've got the background image with the shadow of Count Orlok from Nosferatu. But of course that is now static. That's been hard-coded by putting that class onto the body. What we want to do is actually make that dynamic so that we don't just write class equals Halloween on there. We want to add that dynamically. And that's where we're going to need to use this JavaScript interop, because that sort of thing is not directly accessible from our C# in Blazor. So what we'll do is in the www root where the static stuff's going, I'm going to add another folder and we'll call this one scripts. And then in there, I will add a JavaScript file and I will simply call this interop. You could, of course, write this in TypeScript rather than JavaScript if that's what you want to do, and just make sure you integrate the TypeScript transpilation into the build process somehow. But all I'm going to do here is I'm going to have a function, and I'm going to call this function setHalloween. It's going to take a parameter, which I'm just going to call on, so that's going to be a Boolean, but obviously no types in JavaScript. And then I'm going to do the thing that I can't do in C#. And so remember, what we want to do here is change the class on the body. So we'll say let body equal document dot get element by tag name. And then the tag we're looking for is body. That get elements by tag name returns a list, even though there should only be one here. So we'll just get the first element off that list. And then we're going to use the on parameter, and we're simply going to say if on is true, then we say body.classList.add, and then the class Halloween. Or if not, we can simply say remove. So easy enough to do in JavaScript. The only real trick we're going to have here is to call that setHalloween from our C#. So we can do that. What I'll do actually, I'll add a new component for this. So let's do add eraser component, and I'll call this simply style switcher. And so that's what we've got there. And then I don't need to have that H3 on there. All I'm going to have on here will be a label, which I'll just call Halloween. And then I'll follow that with an input of type checkbox. And then what I need to put on here is @onChange equals, and then simply a method that I'm going to have on here called toggle Halloween. And then in previous examples, I've been doing a separate code behind. So for example, we've got on our bookreviews.razor, we've got the bookreviews.razor.cs, but just for simplicity and to show you what we can do, let's just do this one directly in that @code section. And so what I'm going to do there is I'm going to put in firstly a flag, the thing we're going to toggle. So that's going to be private bool is Halloween. And then I'm going to put in this method, so we can have private void toggle Halloween. Then we've obviously got to toggle it, so we say is Halloween equals not is Halloween. But then we've got to call that method in the JavaScript. And to do that, we need the JavaScript runtime, and that's something that we have to inject. So same sort of thing that we've seen with injection before. We can say inject as an attribute, and then we're going to have a property, and it's going to be of type IJS runtime. So going through an interface, so if you wanted to test this, you could mock it in the normal sort of way, and then we'll call that JS runtime and give it a get and a set. And that should be provided for us when this whole thing is set up. It's complaining because it's a reference type, but we know it's going to be set up, so I'm just going to cheat that with a null exclamation mark on there. So that now means we've got the runtime injected into us, and so now all we need to do is use it. So I'm going to firstly change this to an async function. So async task, and then that's because I'm going to say await JS runtime dot invoke, and you'll see here we've got two possibilities. We've got invoke async, which is generic. If I were returning anything from my JavaScript function, which I'm not here, then you could specify the type as the generic parameter. But because we're not returning anything, I'll do the invoke void async. Then I need to have the name of the method, which was our set Halloween. So that's going to be the first parameter. And then as many subsequent parameters as you like, they're going to be the parameters that have been defined on the function. So in our case, it's just that Boolean. So is Halloween can go on there. And then the last thing we need to do is actually make use of this style switcher. And I'm going to actually go back to our layout, and I'm going to put it up here on this top row where we've got the about button. So just before the about, I'll just put in here my style switcher. And you'll notice what it's done there is, because it's in a different namespace, because it's in a different folder, it has given us the fully qualified name. So we could leave that in there, but personally, I'd rather use the using. So again, just like any other code, it can put a using at the top there. Either way, whichever you prefer to do that. And then one final thing we need to do, which is very easy to forget, we actually need to get that JS into the whole application. So back here in index, there you can see is where it's loading in the JavaScript that's necessary for Blazor itself. But if I drag in our own, then that should now work. So now if we run that up, go to the page, there you can see we've got the Halloween with the checkbox. And if we check the checkbox, then it's dynamically switching, and you can see we've got that styling we had before. So those are the two bits that are coming together. However complex the styling you want for this particular theme, the Halloween theme in this case, you can put all of that in, but you just wrap it around that body.halloween. But then to switch it on or off, we only need to add or remove the class, which is what we're doing there. So very neat to do that. Obviously, for something like Halloween, you wouldn't do it on a checkbox. You'd do it by looking at the date. But whatever the coding you want to change it, we can see now how easy that is to dynamically change. Okay, so that's really one half of the JavaScript interop. The other thing that we sometimes want to do, though, is we want to be able to call our C# from the JavaScript. So we've just done that the other way around, but we can do this both ways. And again, it tends to be when you've got events or whatever coming in from the DOM or from one of the APIs that is not available to you directly in C#. And so what I'm going to do here is something that actually I really would not do this very much in a real application, because it is a bit irritating. And that's to have that feature you may have seen on certain websites where you're in the website, and if you move your mouse pointer out of the window, it pops up a message saying, do you want to leave? Surely you want to stay with us, and starts being a bit irritating about insisting that you stay on the site. It can't force you to, but it does pop up the message. And so I'm going to do something a bit like that. I say not necessarily a good idea, but it does show us the technology we can have here. So let's go back to our interop. And in here, I'm going to put in another function, and I'm going to call this function simply initialize. And this one's going to take a parameter which I'm going to call caller. And that caller is actually going to represent the C# component that has called this initialize function. I'm once again going to get hold of the body. So let's just steal that code. But then what I'm going to do is add an event listener to the body. So I'm going to say body.add event listener. And then the event I'm going to listen for is going to be mouse leave. Okay, so that will get triggered when we move the mouse pointer outside the main body, which is what we're trying to do. And then what I will do is, as a second parameter on there, the function that should be called when the mouse leaves. So we'll do that as an arrow function. And then this is where that caller comes in, because we want to call back to the component that initializes it. So I'm going to say caller dot invoke method async, and then the name of the method on our Blazor component, so I'll call that mouse leave. So we're going to call this initialize from the Blazor C#. That will set up the event listener, and then that will call back to the mouse leave method in our C# when the mouse leave happens. So not much to do there. And of course, ideally, if you're doing this sort of thing, you want to keep your JavaScript to an absolute minimum. So we shouldn't really have any serious logic in there. I mean, I think having this if is probably reasonable, but any real logic wants to go in your C# because we're trying to minimize the amount of JavaScript that we have. So that's what we've got there. Once again, this invoke method async, you could take back a return value, which will give you as a JavaScript promise. You could also put in other parameters, as many as you like, but we're just going to leave it as that. So now what we're going to do is go back to our style switcher. Could be a different component, but we'll just stick with that one. And what we're going to do in here is, firstly, we are going to just override the onInitialized async method. So that gets called automatically by the system when the component's been initialized. We need to make that async, and then we'll await the base class method, and then we'll also say steal it from there. So we're going to invoke a method, but in this case it's just going to be that initialize. And then remember, what we're passing as a parameter is the caller. So that's going to be ourself, going to be this, but you've got to do a bit of wrapping on that. So what we actually do is we say .net object reference .create, and then this. And so it kind of wraps up our component. That's what gets passed through. So now as soon as this component gets created, it's going to call that initialize and set everything up in the JavaScript. But remember, the JavaScript itself is calling back to this mouse leave. So we've also got to put that in there. So we're going to have a public async task called mouse leave. No parameters, but it could have, and it could indeed have a return type other than task. And then what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to have a property. It's going to be bool, and is going to be called show popup. And then in here, I'm going to say show popup equals true. And then the idea is I only want this pop-up to show for a short period of time. So what you might think is, well, we'd have to kick off a timer from there for the short period of time, and then when the timer calls back, we can remove the pop-up. But because we're already inside an async function, we can do something very simple. We can just say await and then task.delay, and let's make it delay for 200 milliseconds. And then we can simply say show popup equals false. So a really neat bit of programming you could apply in all sorts of places in C# where we want to have something that only happens for a short period of time, don't need to call back anymore, just put a delay inside the async method. So we've got this property that we're changing, and let's actually put something in there. So I'm going to have an @if and then show popup. And then inside there, I am simply going to put a div. So nothing that I'm going to put in there, because all the real work I'm going to do as ever in CSS. So I will now add a CSS file that we're going to associate with this style switcher. So style switcher.razor.css. And then what I'm going to do in there is just style that div, because it's the only div in the component and we're using CSS isolation. I don't need to worry about being any more precise than that. So what I'm going to do with this, I'm going to give it a position of fixed with a top of 0 and a left of 0. And then I've got another background image for this one that I've popped in there. So in images, you can see we've got that pop-up. So I'm going to say background image : URL And then this is going to be under images / pop-up. We'll have a background position of center. And we'll have a background repeat of no repeat. And we'll also set the width to 100% and the height to 100%. Okay, so we'll see what that looks like when we've got this all working. And then one final thing we've got to do on this method so that this all works is we've got to add an attribute which is JS invocable. And so that just tells the system that we can call that from the JavaScript as we have it there. So now if we run that up and we go to book reviews, as you can see, if we start moving out of there, it's not actually doing anything. Now we can check a bit of that in the debugger, because if we go and take a look at this, we could go into our function and put a break on there. And if I go back and move out, well, you can see we're actually hitting that breakpoint. So it is coming in here and doing what we want it to, but it doesn't actually appear to display the pop-up. And the reason for this is the fact that this change, having been invoked asynchronously from JavaScript, Blazor itself doesn't realize, as part of its whole cycle of refreshing the screen, doing the binding and that sort of thing, doesn't realize that show pop-up has changed, and so isn't able to actually reflect that change in what it displays on screen. So whenever we do something like this, whenever we have something coming in from JavaScript or anything asynchronous, and we want to change a property, which then wants to have an effect on what's rendered, we've got to do one extra little bit of work, which is after we change the property, we need to call a method on the base class for the component that's implicitly in there called state has changed. But that said, that should also be called asynchronously. So what we in fact do is we say await and then invoke async, which is another method on the base class. And then there we have a lambda, and so that's where we put the state has changed. And so we do that after the first change and after the second change. And so that now means that the DOM and the display should be updated. So now if I run that up and we move out, then you can see flashing up there for just 200 milliseconds, we've got that skull. So if we switch to our Halloween theme, then you can see we get the skull popping up over that. So nothing particularly pretty, but it does show how we can do these things. Firstly, just a general CSS idea that if you want to change a whole theme, you can do it by just putting the theme elements inside the body when you do the CSS, and then all we need to do is apply that one class to the body, or multiple classes. You could do it with dozens of different themes if you wanted to. And then we also saw the fact that we can also then call that in Blazor from the C# by using the JavaScript interop, because to actually set that class on the body, we had to do that in JavaScript. And then we also saw the idea of calling back, so that when we, in this case, leave the body, then it can call back to our Blazor C# and do something, in this case, pop up that skull. So quite a few ideas there, but all around this feature that we have in Blazor that you've got to bear in mind, you can't do absolutely everything as yet directly in Blazor. Not actually really a restriction of Blazor itself. It's a restriction of WebAssembly that doesn't allow these things as yet, and therefore Blazor can't do anything. But I hope that kind of rounded off the picture of where we have to do some things in a slightly more dirty way, but it does allow us to have some really nice features. So hope you enjoyed that. If you did, do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.